The term propaganda originated in the early 17th century when Pope Gregory XV established the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. The congregation's activities within Europe were more than religious evangelization. They amounted to political subversion. It was this political aspect of the Catholic Church's activities that led to the current meaning of propaganda as the systematic, often biased, spread of information for political ends. The Cold War battles between the United States and the Soviet Union over hearts and minds are aptly described as propaganda wars. Many of the methods of modern propaganda were developed by the United States during World War I. From April 1917 until August 1919, the Committee on Public Information, CPI, conducted a systematic campaign to sell U.S. participation in the war to the American public. The CPI produced films, posters, and printed publications and had offices in 10 countries, including the United States. In some cases, it fed newspapers outright lies about American activities in Europe, and occasionally got caught, leading the New York Times to run an editorial calling it the Committee on Public Misinformation. One member of the group later described its activities as psychological warfare. After the war, the weapons of psychological warfare were turned on U.S. and Western European consumers. In a series of books in the 1920s, including Crystallizing Public Opinion, 1923, and Propaganda, 1928, CPI veteran Edward Bernays synthesized results from the social sciences and psychology to develop a general theory of mass manipulation of public opinion, for political purposes, but also for commerce. Bernays' post-war work scarcely distinguished between the political and commercial. One of his most famous campaigns was to rebrand cigarettes as torches of freedom, a symbol of women's liberation, with the goal of breaking down social taboos against women smoking and thus doubling the market for tobacco products. There are many examples of such industry-sponsored beliefs, from the notion that opioids prescribed for acute pain are not addictive to the idea that gun owners are safer than people who do not own guns. Yet the consequences of these activities are all around us. Did, or do, you believe that fat is unhealthy and the main contributor to obesity and heart disease? The sugar industry invested heavily in supporting and promoting research on the health risks of fat to deflect attention from the greater risks of sugar. There are many examples of such industry-sponsored beliefs, from the notion that opioids prescribed for acute pain are not addictive to the idea that gun owners are safer than people who do not own guns. Bernays himself took a rosy view on the role that propaganda, understood to include commercial and industrial information campaigns, could play in a democratic society. In his eyes, it was a tool for beneficial social change, a way of promoting a more free, equal, and just society. He particularly focused on how propaganda could aid the causes of racial and gender equality and education reform. Its usefulness for lining the pockets of Bernays and his clients was simply another point in its favor. After all, he was writing in the United States at the peak of the Roaring Twenties. He had no reason to shy away from capitalism. Propaganda was the key to a successful democracy. Today, it is hard not to read Bernays' books through the lens of their own recommendations, as the work of a public relations spokesman for the public relations industry. And despite his reassurances, a darker side lurks in his pages. He writes, for instance, that those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This might sound like the ramblings of a conspiracy theorist, but in fact, it is far more nefarious. It is an invitation to the conspiracy, drafted by one of its founding fathers, and targeted to would-be titans of industry who would like to have a seat on his shadow council of thought leaders. Perhaps Bernays overstated his case, but his ideas have deeply troubling consequences. If he is right, then the very idea of a democratic society is a chimera. The will of the people is something to be shaped by hidden powers, making representative government meaningless. Our only hope is to identify the tools by which our beliefs, opinions, and preferences are shaped, and look for ways to re-exert control